Section 7 of A Little Tour of France by Henry James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 14. I am shocked at finding, just after this noble declaration of principles, that in a little notebook which at that time I carried about with me, the celebrated city of Angers is denominated a cell. I reproduce this vulgar term with the greatest hesitation, and only because it brings me more quickly to my point. This point is that Angers belongs to the disagreeable class of old towns that have been, as the English say, done up. Not the oldness, but the newness of the place is what strikes the sentimental tourist today, as he wanders with irritation along second-rate boulevards, looking vaguely about him for absent gables. Black Angers, in short, is a victim of modern improvements, and quite unworthy of its admirable name, a name which, like that of Le Mans, has always had, to my eyes, a highly picturesque value. It looks particularly well on the Shakespearean page, in King John, where we imagine it uttered, though such would have not been the utterance of the period, with a fine old insular accent. Angers figures with importance in early English history. It was the capital city of the Plantagenet race, home of that Geoffrey of Anjou who married as second husband the Empress Maud, daughter of Henry I, and competitor of Stephen, and became father of Henry II, first of the Plantagenet kings, born, as we have seen, at Le Mans. The facts create a natural presumption that Angers will look historic. I turned them over in my mind as I travelled in the train from Le Mans, through a country that was really pretty, and looked more like the usual English than like the usual French scenery, with its fields cut up by hedges and a considerable rotundity in its trees. On my way from the station to the hotel, however, it became plain that I should lack a good pretext for passing that night at the Cheval Blanc. I foresaw that I should have contented myself before the end of the day. I remained at the White Horse only long enough to discover that it was an exceptionally good provincial inn, one of the best that I encountered during 6 weeks spent in these establishments. Stupid and vulgarly modernized. That is another phrase for my notebook, and notebooks are not obliged to be reasonable. There are some narrow and tortuous streets with a few curious old houses. I continue to quote. There is a castle, of which the exterior is the most extraordinary, and there is a cathedral of moderate interest. It is fair to say that the Chateau d'Angers is by itself worth a pilgrimage. The only drawback is that you have seen it in a quarter of an hour. You cannot do more than look at it, and one good look does your business. It has no beauty, no grace, no detail, nothing that charms or detains you. It is simply very old and very big, so big and so old that this simple impression is enough, and it takes its place in your recollection as a perfect specimen of a superannuated stronghold. It stands at one end of the town, surrounded by a huge deep moat, which originally contained the waters of the Maine, now divided from it by a quay. The waterfront of Angers is poor, wanting in colour and in movement, and there is always an effect of perversity in a town lying near a great river and yet not upon it. The Loire is only a few miles off, but Angers contents itself with the meagre affluent of that stream. The effect was naturally much better when the huge dark mass of the castle, with its 17 prodigious towers, rose out of the protecting flood. These towers are of tremendous girth and solidity. They are encircled with great bands or hoops of white stone, and are much enlarged at the base. Between them hang vast curtains of infinitely old-looking masonry, apparently a dense conglomeration of slate, the material of which the town was originally built, thanks to rich quarries in the neighbourhood, and to which it owed its appellation of the Black. There are no windows, no apertures, and today no battlements nor roofs. These accessories were removed by Henry III, so that, in spite of its grimness and blackness, the place has not even the interest of looking like a prison, its being, as I supposed, the essence of a prison not to be open to the sky. The only features of the enormous structure are the black, sombre stretches and protrusions of wall, the effect of which on so large a scale is strange and striking. Begun by Philip Augustus and terminated by Saint Louis, the Chateau d'Angers has of course a great deal of history. The luckless Fouquet, the extravagant minister of finance of Louis XIV., whose fall from the heights of grandeur was so sudden and complete, was confined here in 1661, just after his arrest, which had taken place at Nantes. Here also Huguenots and Vendéens have suffered effective captivity. I walked round the parapet which protects the outer edge of the moat. It is all uphill, and the moat deepens and deepens, till I came to the entrance which faces the town, which is as bare and strong as the rest. The concierge took me into the court, but there was nothing to see. The place is used as a magazine of ammunition, and the yard contains a multitude of ugly buildings. The only thing to do was to walk round the bastions for the view, but at the moment of my visit the weather was thick, and the bastions began and ended with themselves. So I came out and took another look at the big black exterior, buttressed with white ribbed towers, and perceived that a desperate sketcher might extract a picture from it, especially if he were to bring in, as they say, the little black bronze statue of the good King René, a weak production of David d'Angers, which, standing within sight, ornaments the melancholy faubourg. He would do much better, however, with the very striking old timbered house, I suppose of the 15th century, which is called the Maison d'Adam, and is easily the first specimen at Angers of the domestic architecture of the past. This admirable house, in the centre of the town, gabled, elaborately timbered, and much restored, is a really imposing monument. The basement is occupied by a linen draper, who flourishes under the auspicious sign of the Mère de Famille, and above his shop the tall front rises in 5 overhanging stories. As the house occupies the angle of a little place, this front is double, and the black beams and wooden supports, displayed over a large surface and carved and interlaced, have a high picturesqueness. The Maison d'Adam is quite in the grand style, and I am sorry to say I failed to learn what history attaches to its name. If I spoke just above of the cathedral as moderate, I suppose I should beg its pardon, for this serious charge was probably prompted by the fact that it consists only of a nave with outside aisles. A little reflection now convinces me that such a form is a distinction, and indeed I find it mentioned rather inconsistently in my notebook a little further on as extremely simple and grand. The nave is spoken of in the same volume as big, serious, and Gothic, though the choir and the transepts are noted as very shallow. But it is not denied that the air of the whole thing is original and striking, and it would therefore appear after all that the cathedral of Angers, built during the 12th and 13th centuries, is a sufficiently honourable church, the more that its high west front, adorned with a very primitive Gothic portal, supports 2 elegant tapering spires, between which, unfortunately, an ugly modern pavilion has been inserted. I remember nothing else at Angers but the curious old Café Serein, where, after I had had my dinner at the inn, I went and waited for the train, which, at 9 o'clock in the evening, was to convey me in a couple of hours to Nantes. An establishment remarkable for its great size and its air of tarnished splendor, its brown gilding and smoky frescoes, as also for the fact that it was hidden away on the second floor of an unassuming house in an unilluminated street. It hardly seemed a place where you would drop in, but when once you had found it, it presented itself, with the cathedral, the castle, and the Maison d'Adam, as one of the historical monuments of Angers. Chapter 15. If I spent 2 nights at Nantes, it was for reasons of convenience rather than of sentiment, though indeed I spent them in a big circular room, which had a stately, lofty, last-century look, a look that consoled me a little for the whole place being dirty. The high, old-fashioned inn, it had a huge, windy porte cochère, and you climbed a vast black stone staircase to get to your room, looked out on a dull square surrounded with other tall houses, and occupied on one side by the theatre, a pompous building decorated with columns and statues of the Muses. Nantes belongs to the class of towns which are always spoken of as fine, and its position near the mouth of the Loire gives it, I believe, much commercial movement. It is a spacious, rather regular city, looking, in the parts that I traversed, neither very fresh nor very venerable. It derives its principal character from the handsome quays on the Loire, which are overhung with tall 18th century houses, very numerous too in the other streets, houses with big entresols marked by arched windows, classic pediments, balcony rails of fine old ironwork. These features exist in still better form at Bordeaux, but putting Bordeaux aside, Nantes is quite architectural. The view up and down the quays has the cool, neutral tone of color that one finds so often in French waterside places, the bright grayness which is the tone of French landscape art. The whole city has rather a grand, or at least an eminently well-established air. During a day passed in it, of course I had time to go to the Musée, the more so that I have a weakness for provincial museums, a sentiment that depends but little on the quality of the collection. The pictures may be bad, but the place is often curious, and indeed from bad pictures and certain moods of the mind there is a degree of entertainment to be derived. If they are tolerably old, they are often touching, but they must have a relative antiquity, for I confess I can do nothing with works of art of which the badness is of recent origin. The cool, still, empty chambers in which indifferent collections are apt to be preserved, the red brick tiles, the diffused light, the musty odor, the mementos around you of dead fashions, the snuffy custodian in a black skull-cap who pulls aside a faded curtain to show you the lustreless gem of the museum, these things have a mild historical quality, and the sallow canvases, after all, illustrate something. Many of those in the Museum of Nantes illustrate the taste of a successful warrior, having been bequeathed to the city by Napoleon's Marshal Clark, created Duc de Feltre. In addition to these, there is the usual number of specimens of the contemporary French school, culled from the annual Salon and presented to the museum by the State. Wherever the traveller goes in France, he is reminded of this very honourable practice, the purchase by the government of a certain number of "pictures of the year," which are presently distributed to the provinces. Governments succeed each other and bid for success by different devices, but the patronage of art is a plank, as we should say here, in every platform. The works of art are often ill selected. There is an official taste which you immediately recognize, but the custom is essentially liberal, and a government which should neglect it would be felt to be painfully common. The only thing in this particular musée that I remember is a fine portrait of a woman by Ingres, very flat and Chinese, but with an interest of line and a great deal of style. There is a castle at Nantes which resembles in some degree that of Angers, but has without much less of the impressiveness of great size, and within much more interest of detail. The court contains the remains of a very fine piece of late Gothic, a tall, elegant building of the 16th century. The chateau is naturally not wanting in history. It was the residence of the old dukes of Brittany, and was brought, with the rest of the province, by the Duchess Anne, the last representative of that race, as her dowry to Charles VIII. I read in the excellent handbook of M. Joanne that it has been visited by almost every one of the kings of France, from Louis XI downward, and also that it has served as a place of sojourn less voluntary on the part of various other distinguished persons, from the horrible Maréchal de Retz, who in the 15th century was executed at Nantes for the murder of a couple of hundred young children sacrificed in abominable rites, to the ardent Duchess of Berry, mother of the Count of Chambord, who was confined there for a few hours in 1832, just after her arrest in a neighboring house. I looked at the house in question, you may see it from the platform in front of the chateau, and tried to figure to myself that embarrassing scene. The Duchess, after having unsuccessfully raised the standard of revolt for the exiled Bourbons in the legitimist Bretagne, and being wanted, as the phrase is, by the police of Louis Philippe, had hidden herself in a small but loyal house at Nantes, where, at the end of 5 months of seclusion, she was betrayed for gold to the austere M. Guizot by one of her servants, an Alsatian Jew named Deutz. For many hours before her capture She had been compressed into an interstice behind a fireplace, and by the time she was drawn forth into the light she had been ominously scorched. The man who showed me the castle indicated also another historic spot, a house with a little tourelle on the Quai de la Fosse, in which Henry IV. Is said to have signed the Edict of Nantes. I am, however, not in a position to answer for this pedigree. There is another point in the history of the fine old houses which command the Loire, of which, I suppose, one may be tolerably sure. That is, their having, placid as they stand there today, looked down on the horrors of the Terror of 1793, the bloody reign of the monster Carrier and his infamous noyade. The most hideous episode of the Revolution was enacted at Nantes, where hundreds of men and women, tied together in couples, were set afloat upon rafts and sunk to the bottom of the Loire. The tall 18th-century house, full of the air noble, in France always reminds me of those dreadful years, of the street scenes of the Revolution. Superficially, the association is incongruous, for nothing could be more formal and decorous than the patent expression of these eligible residences. But whenever I have a vision of prisoners bound on tumbrils that jolt slowly to the scaffold, of heads carried on pikes, of groups of heated citoyennes shaking their fists at closed coach windows, I see in the background the well-ordered features of the architecture of the period, the clear grey stone, the high pilasters, the arching lines of the entresol, the classic pediment, the slate-covered attic. There is not much architecture at Nantes except the domestic. The cathedral, with a rough west front and stunted towers, makes no impression as you approach it. It is true that it does its best to recover its reputation as soon as you have passed the threshold. Begun in 1434 and finished about the end of the 15th century, as I discover in Murray, it has a magnificent nave, not of great length, but of extraordinary height and lightness. On the other hand, it has no choir whatsoever. There is much entertainment in France in seeing what a cathedral will take upon itself to possess or to lack, for it is only the smaller number that have the full complement of features. Some have a very fine nave and no choir, others a very fine choir and no nave. Some have a rich outside and nothing within, others a very blank face and a very glowing heart. There are 100 possibilities of poverty and wealth, and they make the most unexpected combinations. The great treasure of Nantes is the two noble sepulchral monuments which occupy either transept, and one of which has, in its nobleness, the rare distinction of being a production of our own time. On the south side stands the tomb of Francis II, the last of the Dukes of Brittany, and of his second wife, Margaret of Foix, erected in 1507 by their daughter Anne, whom we have encountered already at the Château de Nantes, where she was born; at Langeais, where she married her first husband; at Amboise, where she lost him; at Blois, where she married her second, the good Louis XII., who divorced an impeccable spouse to make room for her, and where she herself died. Transferred to the cathedral from a demolished convent, this monument, the masterpiece of Michel Colomb, author of the charming tomb of the children of Charles VIII. And the aforesaid Anne, which we admired at Saint Gatien of Tours, is one of the most brilliant works of the French Renaissance. It has a splendid effect and is in perfect preservation. A great table of black marble supports the reclining figures of the Duke and Duchess, who lie there peacefully and majestically in their robes and crowns, with their heads each on a cushion, the pair of which are supported from behind by 3 charming little kneeling angels. At the foot of the quiet couple are a lion and a greyhound with heraldic devices. At each of the angles of the table is a large figure in white marble of a woman elaborately dressed, with a symbolic meaning, and these figures, with their contemporary faces and clothes, which give them the air of realistic portraits, are truthful and living, if not remarkably beautiful. Round the sides of the tomb are small images of the apostles. There is a kind of masculine completeness in the work, and a certain robustness of taste. In nothing were the sculptors of the Renaissance more fortunate than in being in advance of us with their tombs. They have left us nothing to say in regard to the great final contrast, the contrast between the immobility of death and the trappings and honors that survive. They expressed in every way in which it was possible to express it the solemnity of their conviction that the marble image was a part of the personal greatness of the defunct, and the protection, the redemption of his memory. A modern tomb, in comparison, is a sceptical affair. It insists too little on the honors. I say this in the face of the fact that one only has to step across the cathedral of Nantes to stand in the presence of one of the purest and most touching of modern tombs. Catholic Brittany has erected in the opposite transept a monument to one of the most devoted of her sons, General de la Moricière, the defender of the Pope, the vanquished of Castelfidardo. This noble work, from the hand of Paul Dubois, is one of the most interesting of that new generation of sculptors who have revived in France an art of which our overdressed century had begun to despair, has every merit but the absence of a certain prime feeling. It is the echo of an earlier time, an echo with a beautiful cadence. Under a Renaissance canopy of white marble, elaborately worked with arabesques and cherubs, in a relief so low that it gives the work a certain look of being softened and worn by time, lies the body of the Breton soldier, with a crucifix clasped to his breast and a shroud thrown over his body. At each of the angles sits a figure in bronze, the two best of which, representing charity and military courage, had given me extraordinary pleasure when they were exhibited in clay in the Salon of 1876. They are admirably cast, and they have a certain greatness, the one a serene, robust young mother, beautiful in line and attitude, the other a lean and vigilant young man, in a helmet that overshadows his serious eyes, resting on an outstretched arm, an admirable military member upon the hilt of a sword. These figures contain abundant assurance that M. Paul Dubois has been attentive to Michelangelo, whom we have all heard called a splendid example but a bad model. The visor-shadowed face of his warrior is more or less a reminiscence of the figure on the tomb of Lorenzo de' Medici at Florence, but it is doubtless none the worse for that. The interest of the work of Paul Dubois is its peculiar seriousness, a kind of moral good faith which is not the commonest feature of French art, and which, united as it is in this case with exceeding knowledge and a remarkable sense of form, produces an impression of deep refinement. The whole monument is a proof of exquisitely careful study, but I am not sure that this impression on the part of the spectator is altogether a happy one. It explains much of its great beauty, and it also explains perhaps a little of a certain weakness. That word, however, is scarcely in place. I only mean that M. Dubois has made a visible effort, which has been most fruitful. Simplicity is not always strength, and our complicated modern genius contains treasures of intention. This fathomless modern element is an immense charm on the part of M. Paul Dubois. I am lost in admiration of the deep aesthetic experience, the enlightenment of taste revealed by such work. After that, I only hope that Giuseppe Garibaldi may have a monument as fair. Chapter 16. To go from Nantes to La Rochelle, you travel straight southward across the historic bocage of La Vendée, the home of royalist bush-fighting. The country, which is exceedingly pretty, bristles with copses, orchards, hedges, and with trees more spreading and sturdy than the traveller is apt to deem the feathery foliage of France. It is true that as I proceeded, it flattened out a good deal, so that for an hour there was a vast featureless plain which offered me little entertainment, beyond the general impression that I was approaching the Bay of Biscay, from which, in reality, I was yet far distant. As we drew near La Rochelle, however, the prospect brightened considerably, and the railway kept its course beside a charming little canal, or canalized river, bordered with trees, and with small, neat, bright colored, and yet old fashioned cottages and villas, which stood back on the further side, behind small gardens, hedges, painted palings, patches of turf. The whole effect was Dutch and delightful, and in being delightful, though not in being Dutch, it prepared me for the charms of La Rochelle, which, from the moment I entered it, I perceived to be a fascinating little town, a most original mixture of brightness and dullness. Part of its brightness comes from its being extraordinarily clean, in which, after all, it is Dutch, a virtue not particularly noticeable at Bourges, Le Mans, and Angers. Whenever I go southward, if it be only 20 miles, I begin to look out for the south, prepared as I am to find the careless grace of those latitudes even in things of which it may be said that they may be south of something, but are not southern. To go from Boston to New York in this state of mind is almost as soft a sensation as descending the Italian side of the Alps. And to go from New York to Philadelphia is to enter a zone of tropical luxuriance and warmth. Given this absurd disposition, I could not fail to flatter myself, on reaching La Rochelle, that I was already in the Midi, and to perceive in everything, in the language of the country, the caractère méridional. Really, a great many things had a hint of it. For that matter, it seems to me that to arrive in the south at a bound, to wake up there, as it were, would be a very imperfect pleasure. The full pleasure is to approach by stages and gradations, to observe the successive shades of difference by which it ceases to be the north. These shades are exceedingly fine, but your true south lover has an eye for them. If he perceive them at New York and Philadelphia, we imagine him boldly as liberated from Boston, how could he fail to perceive them at La Rochelle? The streets of this dear little city are lined with arcades, good, big, straddling arcades of stone, such as befit a land of hot summers, and which recall to me, not to go further, the dusky portions of Bayonne. It contains, moreover, a great wide Place d'Armes, which looked for all the world like the piazza of some dead Italian town, empty, sunny, grass-grown, with a row of yellow houses overhanging it, an unfrequented cafe with a striped awning, a tall, cold, florid, uninteresting cathedral of the 18th century on one side, and on the other a shady walk which forms part of an old rampart. I followed this walk for some time, under the stunted trees, beside the grass-covered bastions. It is very charming, winding and wandering, always with trees. Beneath the rampart is a tidal river, and on the other side, for a long distance, the mossy walls of the immense garden of a seminary. 300 years ago, La Rochelle was the great French stronghold of Protestantism, but today it appears to be a nursery of papists. The walk upon the rampart led me round to one of the gates of the town, where I found some small modern fortifications and sundry red-legged soldiers, and beyond the fortifications another shady walk, a maille, as the French say, as well as a champ de manoeuvre, on which latter expanse the poor little red-legs were doing their exercise. It was all very quiet and very picturesque, rather in miniature, and at once very tidy and a little out of repair. This, however, was but a meagre back view of La Rochelle, or poor side view at best. There are other gates than the small fortified aperture just mentioned. One of them, an old grey arch beneath a fine clock tower, I had passed through on my way from the station. This picturesque Tour de l'Horloge separates the town proper from the port, for beyond the old grey arch the place presents its bright, expressive little face to the sea. I had a charming walk about the harbour, and along the stone piers and sea walls that shut it in. This, indeed, to take things in their order, was after I had had my breakfast, which I took on arriving, and after I had been to the Hôtel de Ville. The inn had a long narrow garden behind it, with some very tall trees, and passing through this garden to a dim and secluded salle à manger, buried in the heavy shade, I had, while I sat at my repast, a feeling of seclusion which amounted almost to a sense of incarceration. I lost this sense, however, after I had paid my bill, and went out to look for traces of the famous siege, which is the principal title of La Rochelle to renown. I had come thither partly because I thought it would be interesting to go stand for a few moments in so gallant a spot, and partly because, I confess, I had a curiosity to see what had been the starting point of the Huguenot emigrants who founded the town of New Rochelle in the state of New York, a place in which I had passed certain memorable hours. It was strange to think, as I strolled through the peaceful little port, that these quiet waters, during the wars of religion, had swelled with a formidable naval power. The Rochellais had fleets and admirals, and their stout little Protestant bottoms carried defiance up and down. To say that I found any traces of the siege would be to misrepresent the taste for vivid whitewash by which La Rochelle is distinguished today. The only trace is the dent in the marble top of the table on which, in the Hôtel de Ville, Jean Guiton, the mayor of the city, brought down his dagger with an oath, when in 1628 the vessels and regiments of Richelieu closed about it on sea and land. This terrible functionary was the soul of the resistance. He held out from February to October in the midst of pestilence and famine. The whole episode has a brilliant place among the sieges of history. It has been related 100 times, and I may only glance at it and pass. I limit my ambition in these light pages to speaking of those things of which I have personally received an impression, and I have no such impression of the defense of La Rochelle. The Hôtel de Ville is a pretty little building, in the style of the Renaissance of Francis I, but it has left much of its interest in the hands of the restorers. It has been done up without mercy. Its natural place would be at Rochelle the New. A sort of battlemented curtain, flanked with turrets, divides it from the street, and contains a low door in a high wall is always felicitous, which admits you to an inner court where you discover the face of the building. It has statues set into it, and is raised upon a very low and very deep arcade. The principal function of the deferential old portress who conducts you over the place is to call your attention to the indented table of Jean Guiton, but she shows you other objects of interest besides. The interior is absolutely new and extremely sumptuous, abounding in tapestries, upholstery, morocco, velvet, satin. This is especially the case with the really beautiful grande salle, where, surrounded with the most expensive upholstery, the mayor holds his official receptions. So at least said my worthy portress. The mayors of La Rochelle appear to have changed a good deal since the days of the grim Guiton, but these evidences of municipal splendor are interesting for the light they throw on French manners. Imagine the mayor of an English or an American town of 20,000 inhabitants holding magisterial soirees in the town hall. The said grande salle, which is unchanged in form and its larger features, is, I believe, the room in which the Rochellais debated as to whether they should shut themselves up, and decided in the affirmative. The table and chair of Jean Guiton have been restored, like everything else, and are very elegant and coquettish pieces of furniture, incongruous relics of a season of starvation and blood. I believe that Protestantism is somewhat shrunken today at La Rochelle, and has taken refuge mainly in the haute société and in a single place of worship. There was nothing particular to remind me of its supposed austerity, as after leaving the Hôtel de Ville I walked along the empty portions and cut out of the Tour de l'Horloge, which I have already mentioned. If I stopped and looked up at this venerable monument, it was not to ascertain the hour, for I foresaw that I should have more time at La Rochelle than I knew what to do with, but because its high, gray, weather-beaten face was an obvious subject for a sketch. The little port, which has two basins, and is accessible only to vessels of light tonnage, had a certain gaiety and as much local color as you please. Fisherfolk of picturesque type were strolling about, most of them Bretons, several of the men with handsome, simple faces, not at all brutal, and with a splendid brownness, the golden brown color on cheek and beard that you see on an old Venetian sail. It was a squally, showery day, with sudden drizzles of sunshine. Rows of rich-toned fishing smacks were drawn up along the quays. The harbour is effective to the eye by reason of three battered old towers, which at different points overhang it and look infinitely weather-washed and sea-silvered. The most striking of these, the Tour de la Lanterne, is a big grey mass of the 15th century, flanked with turrets and crowned with a Gothic steeple. I found it was called by the people of the place the Tour des Quatre Sergents, though I know not what connection it has with the touching history of the four young sergeants of the garrison of La Rochelle, who were arrested in 1821 as conspirators against the government of the Bourbons and executed amid general indignation in Paris in the following year. The quaint little walk, with its label of Rue sur les Murs, to which one ascends from beside the Grosse Horloge, leads to this curious Tour de la Lanterne and passes under it. This walk has the top of the old town wall towards the sea for a parapet on one side, and is bordered on the other with decent but irregular little tenements of fishermen, where brown old women, whose caps are as white as if they were painted, seem chiefly in possession. In this direction there is a very pretty stretch of shore, out of the town, through the fortifications, which are Vauban's, by the way, through also a diminutive public garden, or straggling shrubbery, which edges the water and carries its stunted verdure as far as a big Établissement des Bains. It was too late in the year to bathe, and the établissement had the bankrupt aspect which belongs to such places out of season. So I turned my back upon it, and gained, by a circuit in the course of which there were sundry waterside items to observe, the other side of the cheery little port, where there is a long breakwater and a still longer sea wall, on which I walked a while to inhale the strong salt breath of the Bay of Biscay. La Rochelle serves, in the months of July and August, as a station de bain for a modest provincial society, and putting aside the question of inns, it must be charming on summer afternoons. End of section 7.